Welcome back to another episode of the Hustle Nation podcast. Today, as always, we've got a real treat. Mr. Josh Kosnick is in the house. Josh is a professional EOS implementer and Spartan Leadership podcast host. Josh, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Chris and Dustin. Honored to be here and hopefully pour into your audience and have a high impact today as always.
Well, thanks for joining us. Josh, you and I got connected just really only a few weeks ago through a mutual friend. We were playing golf together and kind of found out just absurdly that we're both kind of in the same space. And what drew me into wanting to have you on the podcast was your incredible story. You know, a lot of adversity, a lot of challenges. And I want to start with that. Tell us a little bit about your journey and how you got to where you are now.
Oh, you want to hit them with the heavy stuff first, huh, Chris?
Yeah, that's what draws people in, Josh.
That's right. All right. So I started my career really in sales. At 16, I was working in Circuit City and continued that through college with Best Buy. I switched over to the dark side to Best Buy and then dropped out of college after I was done, kind of playing football. I went to college to play football, not to go to college. And as soon as my football career kind of ended, I chose to I wouldn't say flunk out, but just my interest wasn't there anymore. So I continued my career with sales management at Best Buy, just continued to plug away. And there was one day I asked for a raise because I was running a top 3 store in the country, and they told me no. And so I chose to go into financial advising really in that same week. And I'm making this story real brief because I know you want the heavy stuff. And, I chose to not work for someone else again, really. I wanted to blaze my own path and not be told what I was worth. And so I went into financial advising, which, Dustin, much like your career, we're all commission and helping people solve their issues and help them plan for the future and all that stuff. But it's really an eat what you kill world. And so I built a beautiful career within the Northwestern Mutual system. Was a financial advisor, grew a very large book, had $100 million of assets under management. And I was also doing some leadership at the time. And I happened to be really, really good at leading and developing other advisors. And so I had to make a choice. And I actually got the opportunity to succeed my father as managing partner at Northwestern Mutual, which was heavily contested, because they didn't like the view of nepotism. But I had to become undeniable and show that I was the right choice for the job. And I had many friends across the country that applied for that position because we were one of the best offices in the country. And the Fortune 100 company chose me to succeed my father. And that was one of the peaks of my life, if not, the peak of my professional life. I put my faith in God and my choice in my wife and kids above that as far as peaks. But professionally, that was certainly a peak to succeed my father and be able to buy him out, send him off into retirement and start my own legacy and build that firm even further. And so my plan, from age 36, I was one of the youngest appointed managing partners in the country at 36. And my plan was to run that for 20 years and grow it as large as possible and have as big of an impact as possible and figure out what my next journey would be at age 56. Well, the age-old adage, you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans, that held true for me too. And so that didn't work out that way. And in fact, in 2021, June 16th, 2021, so not that long ago, celebrated the anniversary, I get a call from executive vice president and says, "Hey, Josh, meet us at the Marriott." And that's only 8 minutes from my house and only a tenth of a mile from my office. And though, you get a call like that, something's not right. And so I show up into the Marriott lobby, and no sooner than my butt hit the chair, they said, "Josh, there's no easy way to say this. We're moving in a different direction. You're no longer managing partner." And the only question I could muster was, what happened? Like what? And I think I said, what happened or why? Something of that nature. It's all a little bit fuzzy. You get that, Charlie Brown, mumble jumble in your head. And And I'm looking around the lobby and I see two familiar faces, which are executive level security detail that I've known for over 10 years because I've been around the company my whole life. And I walk out a few minutes later and go to my car, and I hear later that there's security at my office that I own the lease on, 35,000 square feet, and there's security there in case I became a problem or in case I showed up. It was all out of a movie. Because what was interesting about it is we had grown, this was the year after, well, we were still in the middle of COVID, but we had grown 30% through COVID and we're absolutely crushing it. To make a long story short, what happened was I found out later the reason they terminated me was to get themselves out of a lawsuit. I was developing a young advisor that was pretty narcissistic and kind of had some character flaws. And my mistake in the matter was that I really thought that I could outdevelop him or develop him out of these what I thought were immaturities, but they were truly character flaws. And because he was trying to further his career in kind of a negative way instead of a positive way, he chose to play the race card and sue me for discrimination, even though that wasn't happening at all. And so the Fortune 100 company, B&M in that regard, chose to get themselves out of the lawsuit. And so it's interesting, like, I don't blame them, like, in that regard. Like, they did what they felt was best for them as a company and as a brand. Being 3 years removed, I can look at it from a more mature and less spiteful or a vengeful way. But not, I mean, it hurt. Like, I felt betrayed. I felt, stabbed in the back on multiple levels, not only from the person that did that to me, but also the company that I had put my loyalty into for my whole life. And we went through a 6-month battle of kind of legal back and forth on the buyout and all that different stuff. And that settled on December 29th of 2021. But in that time frame, the blessing and the curse of it was that I couldn't do anything because my leverage against them was that I would start my own firm or join a competitor. And because of that posturing, I couldn't make a move. So I'm literally sitting around for 6 months. And as you guys know, this is Hustle Nation, like high achievers, that's really hard to do. I'm a high achiever. I want to be of value and service to the world. I'm an entrepreneur at heart. Like, I want to be doing something. I had fully in my mind said, hey, for 3 months for the summer, I'm going to take this summer off. Like, when would I ever get that time with my kids ever back? And we had a great summer together. But as soon as they got back into school, I'm going batty, trying to figure out what's next. How can I do something? How can I be of value? So I started coaching a couple of people for free, just to feel of service, of value in some sort of and just to start setting my mind free. Well, as I started doing that, I also got to process the grief, got to process the betrayal, got to process all that bad stuff. But I also started to get to envision the future. And the future for me, as I was being recruited by all the firms across the country, I had this pit in my stomach every time I took a meeting. And the meetings, I had to figure out what that was. And the pit, as I prayed with God and had some reflection, was that I had accomplished everything I set out to in that industry. And God was telling me to forge a different path. And so I started leaning into coaching and speaking and developing people. And my wife at the time, I was telling Dustin this a little bit earlier, is like, in her infinite wisdom, we got 4 young kids. She's like, yeah, I don't want you traveling all over the world while we're trying to raise this family. And I said, that's fair. So I go and have this spiritual experience, and I literally had a field of dreams moment. And if you build it, they'll come. And so I texted a realtor friend of mine and said, hey, find me 80 to 100 acres. I got an idea. And I thought it was going to be a blank slate, and I would have to build everything that I was thinking. And then I shared my vision with a good friend of mine. And he's like, Josh, have you seen this place? And shows me a video of this magnificent place that's literally 12 minutes from downtown Madison. And I go out for a showing, and I happen to know the owner. He built our first house. And so we started conversating and just sharing my vision with him. And it just all, was God led. And now we're sitting here today in this podcast studio that I built out inside the hayloft on the property, where we have a horse arena and a home and a large barn where we can envision all sorts of different events and host retreats and host people out here to get out of their business, to work on their business and go back to their world, to their families as better human beings. So that's the long and short of it, I guess, there, Chris.
So where do you start? I mean, I want to start with resilience. So, going through that process, I mean, I can't even imagine the emotions and the pit in your stomach to go through, to your point, the initial conversation to the 6 months to then figuring out, what are you going to do next? So often, to your point, people have this plan. This is where I'm going. This is what I'm doing. And the minute they get off course, they look at themselves and they negative self-talk. They get in their own head and really don't know where to go next. Can you speak to just candidly just how you picked yourself up, right? Like, what was the process you went through? Because I think there's people going through so many different things that might be in that spot and just trying to figure out, like, how do I pick myself up from here and take that next step forward?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Dustin. There's probably not an exact recipe for everyone, but I can speak to what I did. It's interesting. I'm a really avid reader, and I'm a college dropout that happens to be an avid reader. But I found out that I'm an avid reader because it's now my choice, not being told to read like The Tale of Two Cities or some book that meant nothing to me. Now I'm reading books that mean something to me. So I've read, hundreds of self-development and leadership title books on my own accord now. I couldn't read in that time frame. For like 3 months, I couldn't read. Like I couldn't get past a sentence. And I'm someone that reads daily, the Bible, and I read, self-development books daily. And I couldn't read. It was really, really weird. And it was just the processing of emotions. And my wife handed me this book called The Next Right Thing. And for some reason, that book just resonated with me, where I was able to read it, and then I kicked off my journey back into reading again. And I think it was a lot of processing. I sat by my fire pit with a cigar almost nightly, just processing the grief, processing the emotions. I actually had a business coach at the time that I tried to push away because I'm just like, what are we going to talk about? Like, I'm not in business right now. And he's like, Josh, I think you'll need me more now than ever. And he was right. And I was glad he leaned in and didn't let me push him away. Which, by the way, when we're going through hard stuff, especially us men, we tend to push people away. We tend to isolate. And it's actually the worst thing for us. So if you're going through a hard time, like, lean into your friendships, lean into your Bible studies, lean into your good friends that are trying to be there for you. Like, they want to help pull us out of this pit of despair. And we think we don't want to drag them down in there with us. That's the thought going on in our head. It's like, we don't want to pull you down into our shit. Like, we're like, you don't want anything to do with what's going on in my head right now. But in reality, they do. They want to help lend us a hand to pull us out of that pit. So I would just encourage everyone to lean into their relationships, the people that care about us and that are trying to be there for us in those times of darkness, when all we want to do is isolate because we think we're saving them from our crap at that time. So that I'm glad I had some great people in my life to lean into at that time. But also giving myself that time, that those 6 months, as hard as they were to not work, they allowed me to process all that stuff and get through the stages of grief and get through the betrayal and get through all those emotions. And then also dream about the future. And so I created a real fancy T-chart. I actually journaled in this time for the first time ever in my life. Like, I always knew the positive benefits of journaling through all the self-development books that I've read. Like, I just never did it for whatever reason. Mm-hmm. And my coach at the time said, hey, Josh, you will never have these exact emotions ever again. Like, capture them. And he was right. So I can go back to those journal pages and bring myself right back to those moments. I effectively have dubbed it or affectionately dubbed it my pain journal at this point. But there's sometimes that I go back to it where it's motivating, or I'm looking for inspiration, like, to come back to those tough times, to know that, hey, whatever tough times I go through now, they're not as bad as those moments. They're not as bad as my kids coming up to me and, saying, "Hey, Daddy, why aren't you in your work clothes?" Which at that time, Dustin, as you probably know, was a custom suit and nice shoes and all that stuff that we wear. Now I get to wear T-shirts and whatever I want. But yeah, I got a lot of custom suits collecting dust in my closet right now. I can look back at those journal pages and say, my 3-year-old at the time asking, "Daddy, why are your eyes wet?"
Yeah,
because I couldn't
we talk
stop
about
crying.
it all the time. But people, for the book The Gap and the Gain kind of made this concept super popular, right? That as high achievers, we're always looking at our gap between where we are and where we need to be, and that it's never ending, right? Because we always are raising the bar. And I love your point about some of the value of just writing some of this stuff down and going back to it, and even just taking a minute. There was a old manager of mine that used to be a top leader here at our company. And when I was early in my career, it was always forward, always forward, always forward. And she required me every year. We'd go off site, we'd have a drink, and she would show me stuff that we had done a year prior and 2 years prior. And of course, every time you looked at it, you're like, "Oh my God, we sucked 2 years ago." Right. But and then you'd realize, man, we came so far in such a period of time. And yet if you asked me 10 minutes prior to that, it was, man, we have so much more to do. We have so much more to do. Right. And don't get me wrong. You don't want to be, always looking in the rear view either. Right. You want to be looking forward and driving forward. But I think so often, to your point, I think we way too often undervalue the fact of recognizing where we've come, where we were, the things that we've overcome, and using that as fuel to move forward.
Yeah. It's perspective, and it's learning, and it's growth. So my biggest takeaway from that book, and I incorporated it this year. I had to catch up from this weekend because it was my anniversary and my birthday. And my biggest takeaway from that book that I incorporated was writing down 3 wins each day. So I have a journal next to my bedside that I capture 3 wins per day. If you think about that, that's 21 wins on the week. You got over 1,100 wins on the year if you're doing it every single day. I can't wait to look at that on December 31st and just reflect on all the wins that I've had in 2023.
It's awesome.
Or 2024.
That's the way to do it.
Yeah.
So Josh, when you tell your story, you got to a lot of where we are now, but you left out a little bit about your coaching business, about EOS. I'd love to hear more about how you got into the EOS side of things and where your coaching business is now.
Yeah, that's a great question because I did leave that out. And part of that was as I started working with more entrepreneurs outside of the financial advisory space, I found out that all entrepreneurs struggle with 2 major things, and then they have 136 issues underneath those 2 major things. But the 2 major things are leadership development or human development, however you want to put that, and then systems and processes to help them grow and scale. And so I felt very, very equipped and very good at helping on the leadership development side. I felt a little bit handicapped on the systems and processes side, only because I worked with this Fortune 100 company that had been around since 1857. They had a lot of things figured out that helped us with systems and processes, and just had a mothership in Milwaukee, Wisconsin that could really help us through a lot of those things that most entrepreneurs don't have. So I had leaned into EOS when I was managing partner. I was a little bit too ADD that I didn't read the end of the book of Traction, that I could have hired an implementer to come in and help me, because I would have gladly stroked that check had I been aware of it. And we tried to self-implement. And now, having been fully trained on it, I can confidently say that we may have gotten 20% of it right. So I went and assessed, what were all the operating systems for entrepreneurs out there? And there's several. But because I was familiar with EOS, and because the reviews and everyone that I talked to had glowing reviews and praises for EOS, I decided to lean into EOS as an entrepreneurial operating system that I was going to get trained on and help my coaching clients work through. So I went and got trained a couple years back and have implemented that into my work life, and then also helping others continue to evolve that. And it's been a game changer, because now when I go to talk with an initial discovery meeting with an entrepreneur, like, where are you having the most issues right now? Like, is it on the leadership development side or human capital side, or is it the systems and processes? And then I can lean into one of those paths more deeply, depending on what they tell me and the questions that we ask, to figure out how they're operating their business, or are they operating their business really well? Because there's some businesses, they just have either, they may not call them an integrator, but they may have an operator in the business that's just awesome. So EOS may not even be a thing that they need per se, but they have all these human issues, because all of us, regardless of who we are or how good of an entrepreneur we are or how good of a person we have human issues. And so it just depends on which side of the coin do we want to dive deeper on. So I do individual coaching. I do leadership team coaching. I'll sometimes work with their GM or their sales managers, depending on their needs. A lot of times it's accountability that managers are struggling with, or leaders are struggling with, and holding their people accountable that allows them to elevate their position and elevate the business as a whole. Or if it's more on the operating side, then we lean into the EOS system and continue to dive deep to get them up and running so that they can scale and grow their business at a faster pace.
Josh, when you look at businesses, whether this be pre-EOS or pre-coaching, what do you see more of? Do you see more issues on the leadership and human capital side, or do you see more on the systems and processes, or maybe it's both?
Well, the easy answer is it's always both. I would say it's probably more on the human development, leadership development side. That is, if we were to pick which one that, all entrepreneurs or all people struggle with, it's definitely leadership development or human capital, because humans are messy. We all have our strengths, we all have our weaknesses, and we all have our emotions that we bring to the table, and we have our home life that, no matter how much we try to separate, bleeds into the business. Like, if we have a loved one that's battling an illness, if we have someone that's going through divorce, if we have someone that's battling cancer, like those, like, or just a child with depression or something, like that's going to bleed into the business no matter what. And so it's, how do we compartmentalize, and how do we support, and how do we have empathy, and all these different things for the human while still operating the business and needing a job to get done.
So for someone listening that says, hey, we got SOPs, we've got processes and systems in place, can you still be successful with that? Or do you feel like you got to have both? Because from my perspective, I've seen businesses that have standard operating procedures. They have great systems, maybe not an EOS system, but they struggle because, it just seems like if it's not one, it's the other. And sometimes it's like you said, it's oftentimes both.
Yeah. Well, they can succeed. And oftentimes, because entrepreneurs are so dang resilient, like if they've made it 5 years or longer, which the vast majority of businesses don't, what we often see is they're succeeding despite themselves. Like, they're operating at about 20% of their capacity and succeeding despite themselves, where if they actually leaned into EOS or leaned into some great coaching, they could get to 80%. No one ever gets to 100% capacity. It's a utopia that no one ever gets. It's something to strive for, certainly. But what we strive for is to get into 80%. And that's when you're really, clicking on all cylinders, because we're going to muscle it no matter what. Like, if we lose a key employee to a competitor, to an illness, whatever it may be, like, we're going to go and hire someone, or the owner operator is going to step into that position, because at the end of the day, the business is a living, breathing organism that has to succeed no matter what, because we have payroll, we have livelihoods that count on us and the business succeeding. So entrepreneurs are some of the most resilient people on the planet, if not the most resilient people on the planet. So they're going to figure it out. It's just, do you do it efficiently, or do you do it kind of in spite of yourself, where you then, if you're stepping in and having to do everything, or you're not letting go of the vine, as we say, because you think you're the only one that can do something, then you're sacrificing either your spirituality, your physical health, your relationship with your wife, your relationship with your kids, your relationship with all others outside of the business. And then you have an unhealthy life and spirit. So it's one of those things where when EOS, they call it living the EOS life. What that is, what they're talking about in reference to that is running a great business and also having an awesome life outside of that business. Whereas a lot of business owners, because they either won't let go of the vine and delegate to great people that they've hired, or they haven't built the systems and processes that allow them to delegate and elevate, they end up sacrificing everything else that's great in life to make sure that that business runs because they made promises. They have, you know, I've often told employees, like, you'll never understand the full weight of being an entrepreneur until you've had to sacrifice your own bills to make sure you make payroll. Like, employees will never understand that weight until, like, I remember early on when I hired my first associate as a financial advisor, I had to miss a car payment because I wasn't going to miss her payroll. That's a weight that most employees will never understand.
Just to add to that, I think a lot of times I've seen business leaders that get addicted to the chaos, and they basically forget the value of a framework and the simplicity of your team having common language, common framework to build off, right? So this addiction to the chaos, you see so many business leaders, it's like why can't you pull yourself away? And it's because they're so addicted to what they deem as maybe those micro wins every day. And then when they look at these frameworks, you know, EOS is a great one. Like I was sharing, we use it as well. I think one of the challenges is people, entrepreneurs, they're so used to just muscling it out. Mm-hmm. When all of a sudden it becomes easy, it almost feels disingenuous. It almost feels like it doesn't fit. And there's that, you know, you talked about your time frame of 6 months not driving and the difficulty it went through. I think in a very weird way, just talking to a lot of business leaders about this, I feel like a lot of them get stuck in the chaos because they're afraid that they're going to basically build this system, build this framework, and then what are they going to do? When in reality is, you know, there's always more to do, but I just want you to share, like, as you've talked to a lot of business leaders as well, I'm just curious, have you seen that same kind of addiction?
Yes, 100%. It actually reminds me, I had, well, without disclosing person or giving too much personal info because I want to respect their privacy, I had an advisor who she was a very dramatic person, like always something going on. And what that is that, and you wonder, like, and so maybe someone can identify this if they can identify with being the business owner, is if you've ever had a friend or someone that like creates drama or seems to always have drama around them, that's the condition that they've framed their life in. Whereas they grew up in drama, which is unfortunate for them, right? That's not how we're supposed to grow up in. However, it's become their reality. And so when they don't have drama going on, they actually create it because that gets them back to their baseline. Mm-hmm. And so as a business owner, as you speak to, there's always chaos going on. So like when there's not chaos, it feels abnormal. So then they actually create chaos because that gets them back to their baseline. They don't feel normal when things are going smoothly. And so I just wanted to give that dichotomy for someone that may not understand the chaos of being a business owner. It could be a dramatic thing. It could be a depressing thing or something of that nature that unfortunately that individual has created as their baseline, and they don't know what it's like to be happy and joyful and have this kind of ease of flow of life. So they create that condition that gets them back to their baseline.
So true.
Yeah. You know, this conversation takes me back to the book 10X is Easier Than 2X, or Who Not How. Because I wish I would have read those things well before I was an entrepreneur. And we take some pride in, Dustin, to your point, in the chaos. I think we take pride in like, I'm busy. Oh, I do it all. I do everything. When in reality, that's probably one of the dumbest things you can do. And after you read one of those books or both of them, it is amazing. You realize that by trying to do everything, you're going to continue to be in the hamster wheel, to spin that wheel. And we all know what happens after 3, 4, 5 years of that is you literally burn yourself out. You have no social life. You have no fun. You have no time for anything but work. And you hit the wall. You fail. And so it's one of those things that I think a lot of young entrepreneurs, even young leaders, could benefit from, because we're only capable of so much. But I think it just goes back to the framework and something you referenced earlier, Josh, is that you really need to work on your business. You can't work in your business, at least not every day, not all the time. And you should be working to get yourself out of that position more and more.
Yeah, and I would even take it a step further, Chris, to say that you need to work on yourself harder than you do on your business. Because as you work on yourself, as we talked about earlier about how people will bring their personal issues into their business life, is, well, if your personal issues become less and less of an issue because of how much you're working on your spirit, because of how much you're working on your mental, because of how much you're working on your physical, those become less and less, and you're operating at a really high frequency in your personal world, you can then teach others to do that in the business world as you're doing it in your business and personal life. And so that's the framework that I created with my coaching, as we call it the 5 bridges. And I learned this through getting kicked down the mountain, which we started that story with. Like, how did I get out? Or, I kind of alluded to that, but the epiphany that I had was that I placed my position, I placed Northwestern, I placed money, I placed a lot of things above God. And the Bible's very clear that there's no idols above God. And so when people think of idols, they may think of Zeus, or they may think of another god in more of a secular concept. But in reality, our position, our business, our spouse, our kids, a sports team, all of these things can be idols in our life that we place above God. Think about it, we live in Green Bay Packer country. We've seen work studies that show when the Packers lose, that Monday after, like, there's a certain percentage of work that's like just down because of depressive, because people literally hinge their happiness on a team winning, that they have zero control of the outcome. That's an idol in your life, and whether you realize it or not. So my framework that I created is like, we got to get right, whether you believe in God or not, that's not for me to decide. That's your own journey. But like, you got to get right with your spirit first. I believe in God, so I got to keep him on the pedestal first. Number 2 is we got to be right with our internal, our mental, our emotional, and our physical being. And number 3, we got to get right with our relationships. First God, then yourself, then your spouse, then your kids, and then everyone else after that. Then we can get to the professional stuff, which is bridge 4. We can get to professional, we can get to financial, we can get to creative, we can get to joy. And if we do those first 4 right, then we can get to what I call bridge 5, which is legacy, which is like, how do you want to leave the world? What impact, what imprint do you want to have on the world? But you only get to that point is if you do the first 4 right.
Love that. I love that. And I think it's interesting because just picturing that framework, right? Those bridges, you see it so often where people are jumping too far ahead without really their foundation of, what really is important to them. I mean, Chris and I have talked about this forever. No matter what you're talking about in life, the lack of vision, the lack of that clear vision of, what really are your priorities? Everyone talks about, I don't have time and I can't do this or that. It's like, it has nothing to do with time. It has everything to do with prioritization. And, prioritization usually is wrong because you haven't done like what you've talked about, right? Really thinking through what are your different levels? What really is important? What are you really who are you trying to be? Right. And I love the last thing that you said, which was really one of the first things you said, which is you got to start with yourself. The vision that comes to mind to me is like when you're on an airplane, right? And they tell you to put on your own mask first, right? Because if you don't do that first, right, you might pass out in the process, and then your loved one's going to be impacted as well. So, right. How do you start with getting yourself right so that all those around you can feed off of that?
Yeah, I use that analogy a lot, Dustin. It's because if you're passed out, if you're unhealthy, if you're dead, you're of no use to anyone else. That's why the flight attendants tell you to put that oxygen on yourself first so that you can be of service to others.
Mm-hmm. Love that. So, Josh, as you look at where you are and then where you're going, right? So, I mean, it's amazing to see how fast and how far you've come in a transformation so significant in just a few years. And so knowing you're an ambitious guy, what do you, as you look in the next 3 to 5 years, like what are the things that you're looking forward to, that you're trying to tackle as you tackle your 5 bridges?
Oh, that's a great question as well. So it's interesting, right? I could have stayed down and no one would have blamed me, right? They would have understood, especially how fast and how hard I got kicked down. But I couldn't do it because I always taught my kids as young as they started trying to walk, what happens when we fall down? We get back up. And so, what example would I have set had I stayed down? And even staying down, right? Like I got paid a very large sum of money that I could have taken years to figure out what I was going to do next. And, but again, we talked about, like, I was already going batty, not being able to be of service in that 6 months, let alone take 6 years off or whatever and live off of the large buyout. I just couldn't do it. So for me, and looking forward, it's how God set me free to not just have an impact within that organization of 250 people, but to have an impact across the globe. And so we're doing that with the podcast. We're doing that with bringing leadership teams and leaders out here so that we can spread that impact and get people to do it the right way, to teach people the lessons that I've learned the hard way, so that hopefully they don't have to learn them the hard way. Like we've seen too many entrepreneurs end up divorced, estranged relationships with their kids, extremely overweight because they're eating fast food because they're just getting back to the grind and whatever it may be, not eating healthy, not looking out for themselves. All those things I want to say, like, look, that's not the way, right? So I want to have a continually bigger impact the more and more we grow. So I have some masterminds that I do that are a little bit larger impact, like more group coaching. So I run one specifically for advisors, and then I run one for entrepreneurs. And then I do the one-on-one coaching. And then the EOS stuff is more team related. Chris and I have talked about running a summit down here, hosting people that are great speakers, great impactors that can actually. So I use the word impactors on purpose because there's too many quote unquote influencers out there that aren't truly influencing, right? Everyone wants to be a social media influencer. Like I want to be of impact, not of influence. I mean, influence is a great leadership trait, but the way it's used on social media nowadays is like, it's all smoke and mirrors, right? You got people renting Lambos talking about buy my course, and they don't teach them anything because they're showing the flash and not the substance. I want to be a person of substance to teach people to do it the right way and continue to have a larger and larger impact across the globe.
It's awesome. So some great things on the horizon. It's really cool to see. Love it.
I love the thought of impactor. And as someone who comes from a marketing background, I've never liked the word influencer. I've used the word personal brand, focusing on my personal brand. But that's not something you can say outwardly and like, oh, someone gets impressed with that. I like the idea of being an impactor. And I say this out loud because I want people listening to resonate with this too, is that, if your sole goal in anything in life is to help people, which has always been mine, is to 3 things. It's to educate, empower, and inspire people. Doesn't matter what I'm doing, what I'm talking about. That's my big thing. And I think you can chalk it up to that. I think you can chalk it up to being an impactor. I think that's wonderful.
Yeah.
So Josh, as you talk about your 5 bridges, what's next for you?
So I'm writing a book as we speak that's going to encompass the 5 bridges. I was going to put it out, and Chris, you'll know this as a marketer, right? I was going to put it out as a white paper for free. And then I had a couple people read it that I trust, and they're like, no, this is a book and it needs to get in more hands. And whether I charge, normal $20 or I do it for a lesser amount, we'll determine that as I work with people that know more than I do about publishing. But bottom line is I had it, at like 15,000 words and was going to put it out as a white paper just to create as much impact as I could as quickly as possible. And then they're like, no, let's have a bigger impact and do it the right way. And I'm like, yeah, I like doing things the right way. So I'm currently writing a book to get that out to the world to have a bigger impact. And, you think about those things, whether you guys are doing this podcast, the Hustle Nation, I do the Spartan Leadership podcast. I've talked about this. When I started my podcast a few years ago, I changed names when I switched out of Northwestern and started Spartan Leadership. You can still listen to the old episodes, which were called Inspire People, Impact Lives, that was my mission. So I just named the podcast that. And so now all my sign-offs are Inspire and Impact. And I still have that because that's a core focus of mine. That being said, if I died today, my kids, my grandkids, my great-grandkids, and every other lineage would always have my voice, my thoughts, whatever it may be. If I'm blessed to live another 50 years and I continue doing the podcast, like, how could that spread? Whether I get 1,000 downloads per podcast or 1,000,000, doesn't matter. That my voice and impact will always be felt through that. And that's the same thing with writing a book, is continuing to get, like, the world needs more and more positive impactors, right? The influence. So it's interesting that the word influence is very powerful. John Maxwell talks about leadership being influence, nothing more, nothing less. That being said, on social media, it's about influencing in a really weird, warped way, like dancing and makeup and stuff that just doesn't matter. Because I now have a 12-year-old and I'm seeing some of, like, she's not allowed on social media, but she has YouTube, and I'm seeing some of those YouTube shorts, and I'm like, this is awful. Like, you're not. This is like, you're going brain dead watching any of this. Like, let's figure out the algorithm to make sure that we're getting as much impact as possible, and not this crap. So, the book, continuing to coach and develop as many people that are aligned with my personality, right? Because we're not for everyone. That's another thing to remember, is that there's going to be people that love me and hate me, based on how I come across or personality or whatever it may be. And by the way, that's a good lesson for everyone. If you think about the presidential election, it's about whether, Trump and Biden, I think we've become more polarized than ever. But even if you go back to, say, Obama, McCain, like, there's 50% of the country that hated Obama and 50% of the country that hated McCain, right? So, but they get to the most elevated office in our country. So they literally have 50% of the people that absolutely hate them, the 50% that absolutely love them. Like, so if you just think about that in your own personal life, you're going to have lovers and you're going to have haters, and it's only pouring your life into those that resonate with you. And those that don't, be okay with that. And so I am totally okay with some people not liking me. I think you have to respect me with what I've done, but that's on you too. That being said, like, being perfectly okay with people not liking you and people that do like you. And it's finding your tribe and impacting them to the highest degree that you possibly can.
Fantastic.
That's a gold nugget right there, Josh. Thank you. Hey, I want to ask you something. I don't normally ask this question, but you said you're an avid reader. Dustin and I, very much the same. I want to know either one of two things. What's either your favorite book or the most impactful book you've ever read? And because I know you're a man of faith, let's take the Bible out of this equation.
Yeah, I would have said that. Well, I will say the book of if you're leadership inclined, I think the book of Proverbs is one of the best leadership books ever. So even if you do, like, that's the thing about people that, because Christianity's become polarized. But if you just take the context and just follow Jesus's leadership, forget that he's a religious figure. Like, he's the best leader of all time. And if you read the book of Proverbs, it's actually one of the best leadership books of all time. But if we take the Bible out of it, my most impactful book of all time is Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. I can go back to that book and read it over and over and over again. One of the chapters, because it's uncomfortable, that gets skipped over a lot, is the chapter on sexual transmutation. And because that's a polarizing topic, or because people have been brought up with some guilt and shame around sex, I think it gets skipped over. But the point of it is that, and this took me to like the sixth time of reading this book to actually take that chapter seriously, because the first few times I did the same thing. I was like, this is kind of uncomfortable. I'm going to skip through this or read through it quickly. But the point is, like, we've all been in a position where that has been the only thing on our mind. Whether you're a male or female, we've all had a time in our life where sex was the only thing on our mind. And the point of that was to say, if you could take that energy that was the only thing on your mind, and transmute that into a vision or goal and have that be the only thing on your mind, the powers that would be unleashed and the goals that you would hit would be monumental. And so I just want to point that out because it tends to be an uncomfortable one where people gloss over that chapter. And I think they missed the point. And I certainly did the first few times I read the book. But overall, that book was so far ahead of its time. And I'm convinced that every self-development book since then has kind of gleaned pieces or stolen pieces and said in a different way from that book.
I think this is honestly the first time we've talked about sexual transmutation on this show.
You're welcome.
Josh, due to time, we got to wrap this up. But thank you so much for being here. This was an delightful conversation, as I knew it would be. Before I let you go, tell everyone where they can find you and what else you might have going on.
So Spartan Leadership Podcast is on all platforms if you want to check it out. That being said, joshkosnick.com, that's the main website. And then I have good SEO, Chris. Chris Burns, there's probably several of you across the world. Josh Kosnick, I haven't met another one. So at Josh Kosnick on all social media platforms, from LinkedIn to Instagram, Facebook, any of those. So pretty easy. Kosnick is how you spell the last name, even though restaurants and everywhere else seems to butcher that. But pretty easy to find me.
Awesome. Listeners, thanks for tuning in to another episode. We appreciate the ears. Until next time, peace.